Well, kia ora everyone, and formally welcome to all of you this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Our first private V-Room for New Zealand that we've hosted in our online series. So it's brilliant to have all of you with us, and of course our guest of honour, John Edwards, the Privacy Commissioner. John, welcome and thank you for your first time with us here at the Circle, and look forward to meeting you in person sometime in the near future. I also want to welcome and introduce Peter Bailey, of course, General Manager of Aura Information Security. Peter, brilliant to have you with us as always, and thank you so much to Aura for your support in bringing us all together in this virtual room this morning. I particularly wanted to also welcome all of our members that are with us in the room today, including lots of the Cordia family. Great to have you with us as well. Just wanted to remind everyone that today's briefing is on the record, and as you would have just seen, we are recording this. And also wanted to welcome Brent, who is here from Business Desk, or will be joining us if he's not here yet. And also just to let you know, we really want this to be interactive. Peter will go through about 20 minutes of questions with John, and then we really encourage you to either unmute yourself and indicate to Peter that you've got a question, or use the chat function to let him know that you've got a question, to make sure that we get all of your questions to John as well during this time. So welcome again, and I'll hand over to Peter to get us started.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Thanks everyone for dialing in and welcome. My first day back in the city and in the real office, so that's always fun. And it's been quite an interesting time. So thank you very much, John, for making the time to chat to us this morning. And as Sharon said, we'll do about 20 minutes of some pre-prepared questions that we'll run through, and then we'd love to get your questions as well from the floor. So I guess, John, for starters, for you, how have you spent your last month? You been at home, in your bubble, or in the office? How's that been?
Kia ora koutou katoa. Thanks for coming along. Yeah, hi Peter, thank you. Just like everybody else, lockdown and limited to immediate family. It's been strange, lots of Zooming. My whole team has been locked down, and it seems that many of them are in no great rush to come back. I normally look out of my office here and I have 25 people or so on the floor, and another dozen in Auckland. I think there's only one person in the Auckland office, and there's only about half a dozen here. So yeah, we've been just doing what everybody else in the country has been doing.
Everyone's enjoying working from home, I think. Yeah, definitely. And obviously, with the last few months, it's not just been a New Zealand issue. Obviously, it's been all over the world and in Australia as well. So, with the issues we've had to deal with over the last few months, how has your position been here, during this time, and how's that differed from some of your colleagues in Australia and what they've been dealing with over there?
Well, I mean, our agenda, our work plan has been upended by COVID. There has been significant developments relating to personal information. We've found that the central agencies have been so preoccupied by the crisis and the immediate response, they haven't necessarily had the time or bandwidth to properly engage the privacy issues. And we've seen some confusion, for example, just last week as we stepped down to level 2. On Wednesday, I think, retailers were expected to maintain contact tracing registers. That then changed as the rules switched to just hospitality industry. So there has been some mixed messages, and we've been trying to be as proactive as we can and provide public messaging about what you can and can't do, what the expectations on you are, what your rights are as an individual, but also trying to have input at a policy level and to keep ahead of issues where we think, okay, maybe this is going a little bit too far, or yes, it's a crisis, but that's not a carte blanche. We've been busily looking at contact tracing apps, and you mentioned my Australian colleagues. Of course, in Australia there is a federal Office of the Australian Information Commissioner who has jurisdiction over federal government institutions as well as businesses with a turnover of more than 3 million. She's been very involved in assessing the contact tracing app that was issued a couple of weeks ago. and advising the parliamentary committee. So a similar kind of role, I think. I haven't been so, I haven't kept up so much with some of the state commissioners' work. And there are, of course, privacy commissioners in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and in the Northern Territories. So I haven't seen what they've been up to, but some of those officers also have a jurisdiction in relation to freedom of information. The Federal Commissioner does, and that takes up quite a lot of their time. And certainly in a crisis time like this, people want good information. So I imagine that's been occupying her. That job here is done by the Ombudsman.
Right. So you've talked there a little bit about the contact tracing, excuse me, which I'm sure is of great interest to a lot of people at the moment. So I might just jump a little bit around in some of the questions we've got here. So contact tracing is a topic that everyone's chatting about at the moment, and particularly with the application. So we've seen it used in a number of other countries. So we've seen it in, like you say, in Australia, we've seen it in Singapore, and it looks like we're well on the way here with an interim one coming in tomorrow, and then a full app later on. Is there anything we should be concerned about as New Zealanders around our personal data with these applications, and how do we ensure that the data we're giving or writing down or signing up to, how do we ensure that that's looked after properly?
Yeah, I think we probably could have had stronger leadership, central and coordinated leadership in this area from government. It has led to a proliferation of solutions springing up. We're in the process of assessing some of those and should have something to post on our website later in the day because they have different degrees of privacy friendliness, if you like. There's one app that has been developed by a company in Christchurch, which asks visitors to scan an identity document. Now, I haven't put my concerns to that organisation, but I think that probably goes too far. I think that's unnecessary, and I don't think New Zealanders would take too kindly to that. The thing is, if you collect more information than you need, you create a security risk for yourself. And what happens if that leaks? We've seen identity documents leaked as part of the TUIA 250 promotion, which happened a few months ago. So there are many different apps being developed and very little information for consumers and retailers and hospitality about what's the best one. So we'll be putting out some guidance on that. We've got to remember what contact tracing is about. And what technology can do. Contact tracing is a clinical intervention undertaken by a trained nurse, usually, I think, who's sitting there in a room with a phone. And he or she is talking to a person who has confirmed a confirmed diagnosis of COVID-19. And the object is to interview that person and find out where they've been during their period of infection. And then from that, to work out and identify and warn people who may have come into contact. So the fundamental design principle of any application or technological intervention should be, is it going to help that person in that room? Or is it going to get in the way? And some of the solutions that we're seeing internationally might in fact be getting in the way. If, for example, you grab you try and trace somebody by using GPS data and then identify everybody who's been in the same coordinate at around about the same time, and you can do that, and some jurisdictions have looked at this. What you will find is that you will identify a whole lot more people than are within a clinically relevant range. Now that means instead of calling 10 people that you've identified as having come into contact, you might have to call 100, 90 of whom didn't need a call anyway. And that puts increased strain onto those contact traces. So we're really interested in trying to always assess the proposed solutions against what's going to make the best difference to those people. One option that there's been a lot of talk about and there's been apps developed around the world is Bluetooth signaling, because Bluetooth can identify people within that 1 to 2 meters clinically significant range. The first app to get out of the blocks on that was the Trace Together app from Singapore, which has been modified for adoption in Australia. And it's been uploaded, I think, by about 4 million Australians, downloaded, I should say. About 1 million Singaporeans have downloaded it. Now, it's not working in Australia yet, as far as I'm aware, but it is in Singapore. But it's been going for weeks in Singapore and maybe a month or more. But it's it's been downloaded by 1/5 of the population, but it's only assisted in locating about 6 people who otherwise wouldn't have been identified by manual contact tracing. So we've got to just temper our enthusiasm for the automated technology with a reality check about how useful it's actually going to be.
Mm. You were talking there a little bit as well about the GPS tracking, for example. One of the things that's been discussed as well is large digital companies do hold a lot of our data currently, and often GPS data, and they know where we are for advertising reasons or whatever we've signed up to. Some people are arguing, should there be an ability for government to access that information that these companies hold on us to try and track and trace where we are? What's your thinking around that?
Well, again, most contact tracing, the underlying principle is of technology is to act as a memory prompt for the individual. So we see some jurisdictions, a contact tracer will talk to the exposed or to the diagnosed individual. They'll say, well, where were you on Tuesday 2 weeks ago? They may not remember. So they might say, well, let's have a look at your phone records. Let's have a look at your banking transaction records. That might help us. Most of that is done on a voluntary basis, controlled by the individual. I think I and my colleagues around the world would have grave reservations about accessing digital platforms, GPS data, for example, in order to undertake contact tracing that the individual wasn't at the center of. It may be of dubious value, and it certainly undermines the kind of public trust. We've had this extraordinary collaborative effort where people have agreed to this new social contract of coming together to combat the virus in a number of ways that have been unprecedented. And that relies on, I think, a sort of common sense of purpose. When we start getting coercive and putting these powers that bypass the autonomy of the individual, I think that's where you put that social contract at risk. And we look around the world at different principles that are articulated by the World Health Organization, by the OECD. Most of them put public trust as a central determinant of the success of any intervention. So we've got to be very careful about sort of strong-arming our way into data sets and things.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. Slight change in tack. One of the things we often see from a security perspective at Aura is when we're in times of crisis and things are a bit crazy, people tend to forget about the correct procedures or standards that they should follow to do something. Obviously, the last few months have been sort of unprecedented for most of us. Is there anything you've seen happening over that time that's a concerning trend around normal standards or protections that companies are dropping or ignoring through the crisis period?
I wouldn't say a concerning trend, but a necessary expedient, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, the legal standard for security under the New Zealand Privacy Act is that as a holder of personal information, you must take such steps as are in the circumstances reasonable to ensure it's adequately protected. Now, when those circumstances change, those standards change. My office, for example, has a clear desk policy. We have files locked away in cabinets. We have a whole lot of protocols. I've got a security system on the door. We've got lifts that lock off, all of that stuff. Now, I've sent all my staff home to do exactly the same work, but from their bedroom, from a flat that they share with 5 other people. I have to recognize in doing that I am not going to get the same security safeguard. That when someone is talking to a complainant, there is a chance that somebody in that household might overhear parts of that conversation and compromise that security or privacy. So that's a reality. And I think the important thing, Peter, is to recognize when we back out of that extraordinary circumstance that we recognize that we are expected to maintain a higher level of security over the information as we come out of the crisis. And maybe we need to have a closer look at some of the corners we've cut. Are we comfortable? What have a formal policy about what we can talk about over Zoom, for example, or Microsoft, what's the other one? Teams, or there's plethora of platforms that we've all become involved with, WebEx and the like, and sort of stress test some of those things. So I do think we need to have a purposeful moving back to business as usual, and recognizing that some of the corners we've cut should only have been temporary, urgent, emergency purposes.
So you sort of see as we move, obviously we moved into level 2, and then as we go back into level 1, so the way we treat data and the privacy rules around that will shift from a pragmatic standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've relaxed standards because you simply can't patch the systems or audit the devices or whatever it is that you would typically do as part of your suite of security assurance, then you need to consciously move back to your best practice.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. No, that makes sense. So during this period as well, we and even before that, actually, we've seen a move particularly from government, leveraging cloud and online services and a lot of information for New Zealand public moving into the cloud. So what does that mean for you in the Privacy Commission working with this move to cloud, and have there been new initiatives that you've been involved in?
Well, we actually moved our infrastructure to the cloud a couple of years ago. So we did a very detailed privacy impact assessment, but our server licenses were expiring, and we needed to consider our options. And we ended up going with a Microsoft Azure based in Sydney solution, which is, a lot of people found a little bit surprising that a privacy commissioner would not only use a cloud service provider, but one based outside the jurisdiction. But we did a due diligence, and we were satisfied that the resources available to Microsoft Azure were better than any that we could manage locally. And the price distinction was really relevant. So this has been an ongoing trend which has accelerated, but it doesn't exempt any agency from undertaking their own due diligence and making sure that whatever kind of platform they're using has got adequate privacy protection. I mean, I had somebody here who I wanted to find a bit of support for their writing, for example. And I suggested that why don't we just, for a trial period, see if we can get this stuff reviewed on, run through Grammarly. And my team looked at Grammarly and they said, well, no, actually, because what that platform does is it takes all the content, uploads it, stores it outside the jurisdiction, and we're dealing with very sensitive content. So we decided not to go with that solution. Some of you will be using Slack. Some of you, so it's a question of just having a deliberate process of assessment and assurance and adequate settings, policies for the use of those platforms. Just storing stuff, just using internationally based platforms is not of itself a warning. But under the new Privacy Act, which we're going to talk about in a moment, I think, there will be limitations on the movement of data overseas. That won't apply to purely cloud-based services that are not using the information for any of their own purposes. But we will need to be more conscious of the movement of data outside the jurisdiction.
Mm. So let's jump to that one quickly, actually. So the privacy legislation changes, obviously this has been sort of coming for a little while. I mean, certainly in the security industry, we're quite excited about the changes coming. Where is that at the moment, and how is that progressing?
It's in COVID limbo, like many things. I would have expected it to have been passed by now. It came out of a select committee. It's ready for a process called the Committee of the Whole House, which is a debate in Parliament where they go through it clause by clause, and anyone can propose amendments. And then it will have a third reading. I've been urging the Minister to accelerate that as soon as we get a clear space after all the COVID legislation, but of course we've had budget, we've got a lot of emergency COVID stuff. So I'm not sure when we will see that come back into the House. Just before the lockdown, the Minister introduced a supplementary order paper, and that is a process by which he proposes amendments that are introduced at that Committee of the Whole stage. One of the changes that he added there was to the commencement date. So the bill now has a commencement date of 1 November 2020. That's the clearest indication we've got of the government's intentions for timing. Right. I did mention that to the Minister that I thought it would be valuable to have a clear 6 months from passing to coming into effect, just to allow industry and my office to gear up. We could probably do it a bit quicker than that, but if we get a bill passed by sometime in June, I would still be expecting to have it come into force in this year.
Yeah, and so with that legislation coming in, and I remember I went over to Australia when they brought in their notifiable breach legislation and was chatting to companies over there, and was aware how little preparation some organisations had done. Do you feel that organisations here are aware of those changes, and how ready do you think they are?
Some of them are, but it's human nature not to engage with things until they're right in your face. So once it's passed and coming into force, I expect to see a significant clamouring for more information, and we're in the process of developing that. We're developing a tool. So for those who aren't aware, Peter has just described what we call in our legislation mandatory privacy breach notification. It will impose an obligation on any agency that experiences a privacy breach that could cause some serious harm, an obligation to notify both my office and the affected individuals. So we will be developing a decision-making tool to enable people to assess whether a breach that they've experienced reaches that threshold for serious harm, and an online reporting mechanism that will allow us to get the information that we need to process that report and extract the value from it for the wider community.
And with those changes, because if we look at the Australian legislation and GDPR and some of the other international legislation changes that have come in, some of that's been quite, sort of the fine regimes have been quite big, and some of the legislation is quite far-reaching. Do you think the changes we're doing will give New Zealanders good protection over their information?
I think it will be an improvement. I will have the power to issue compliance notices, which I've never had before, and that should raise the general standard. What we don't have is the kind of financial incentives that you've described with the GDPR, and even in the US, where Facebook last year got a fine of $5 billion from the Federal Trade Commission for its breaching its privacy undertakings. and in Europe, an ability to fine of up to 4% of global revenue. Now that is the kind of incentive that gets companies sitting up and taking notice. Late last year, my UK colleague announced an intention to fine British Airways £186 million. I'm not sure whether they'll be able to pay that now, but it just does give an indication of the kind of quantum that we're talking about. For me, when I notice breaches of the Privacy Act, I will be able to issue compliance notices. And if those are not observed, I can bring enforcement proceedings in the Human Rights Review Tribunal. Those will be capped at $10,000. So it's quite a significant difference in quantum.
But it's a good, as you say, it's a good start, and certainly gives you more authority. What I'll do at this point, Sharon, I think I'll open up to the floor for some questions. I see there's already one that's come from Dave that you popped up on chat. David, I don't know if do you want to ask that yourself? You're welcome to come off mute and ask that question.
Sure thing. Thanks, Peter. I thought you were going to ask the questions, but that's fine. I'll jump in. Hi, John. We're hearing rhetoric in the market about an increased number of attacks of businesses in New Zealand, especially with the workforce now operating remotely. Are you seeing much evidence of that from the Privacy Commissioner's perspective?
You mean malicious online attacks?
Yes, phishing attacks and
oh, yeah.
The loss of private information, etc.
Yeah, we don't necessarily see those, Dave. There's no obligation for them to be reported to us. NetSafe keeps track of them, and of course the CERT, the Cyber Emergency Response Team, does have a role there. But we have a voluntary notification scheme, and we've seen notifications steadily climb. The difference between what those other agencies might be seeing and what we see is that we probably only see ones that are successful. There's an awful lot of phishing attempts and DDoS attempts and malware attempts that people just click past and they don't cause any harm. People tend to notify us when data is exfiltrated or we see malware placed on servers that could compromise the security.
To unmute myself. Great,
thank
thanks.
you.
Thanks, John. Juliet, you had a question. If you'd like to go ahead and ask that.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, John. Juliet here at Vodafone. I have a question for you. It's more of a question, I guess, about society, which is that I think there's been an observation that in times of crises, people tend to have a greater appetite to give up their human rights for the good cause. And you kind of alluded to this with the new social contract, and this isn't just privacy, there's other sort of human rights as well. And I worry about that, and I wonder if you think this is a problem in New Zealand and or overseas, and if it is a problem, whose role is it to, I guess, help people pull back from this short period of time where we've compromised some rights because we think it's the right thing to do, but that actually from an ongoing sustainable perspective that's probably not the right thing for us to do? And how do we prevent society continuing to slip into that, and is that a role for policy and government acknowledging that they may be conflicted in that? Is that a role for media? Is that a role for you? How do you see that playing out in New Zealand?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, and I do think it's a role that we have. We are very concerned about ensuring there is a proportional response. Now, I was aware early in the lockdown period of proposals to use telecommunications data for contact tracing purposes, and I was very worried about that. And I didn't support that. I thought it probably wouldn't pass that first test of being useful. And if it doesn't do that, then we don't even need to have the conversation about whether it's a valid, whether we can mitigate the privacy risks. You just say, well, no, there's no case. you're intruding into people's privacy for something that won't work, so just don't. For other kind of interventions, we are very concerned about ensuring proportionality of response, so that we don't necessarily throw everything under the bus in a way that it's quite difficult to come back from. That's why we've been interested in seeing the development of apps that use perhaps decentralized approaches or diary approaches, which maintain the autonomy with the individual, rather than just providing a pipeline for information to a central government source. I don't support that at all. Not everyone in New Zealand needs to be contact traced. Only a tiny proportion do. And you should access information about those only when you absolutely need it. And first, you should do so from the individual themselves. And if they are incapacitated or unable, then you start looking around for sources of data elsewhere. And if somebody came to you, Juliet, and said, I need you to show me John Edwards' geolocation data from his Vodafone account in order to do contact tracing, you would say, well, we're here to do everything we possibly can to help with this, but we're not going to do that. You need to really meet a high threshold. Show me why this is necessary to protect public health. How are you going to use it? If you meet that threshold, then legally you can disclose the information. But as you say, if it becomes a habit, then it can be difficult to sort of walk that back.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Juliet. Questions from anyone else on the call?
Hi, yeah, I'd like to ask a question. It's Helen Little here from Air New Zealand. I'm quite interested in the data going offshore comment that you made. I'm particularly interested in data sovereignty, and it's a linked question. So the apps that we've been seeing discussed is possibly the first time that we've had such wide-scale digital access or discussion around it for individuals, and yet we seem to have given away a lot of private data to large tech companies like Google Maps, for example. We seem to be quite happy to give that away. Do you see that this conversation that we're having around digital invasion of privacy starting to open up that understanding of how much privacy we're already giving away?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I think very much so. And you use the words giving away, which is accurate. We have traded off convenience for data, but I don't think those trade-offs have necessarily been based on good information. I think a lot of those digital platforms that have made these enormous fortunes out of data have been motivated to be open and honest with us about how they're using that data. And we're just now waking up to that. I think there will be increased pressure on those organizations to be more accountable, to give us more autonomy. Google, for example, I would expect to be deleting location data in a more transparent way. But this being an international problem as well really adds complexity. We now have the GDPR, under which Facebook operates and Twitter operates, for example, for a lot of the world, which requires very high levels of compliance. On the other side of the Atlantic, or actually on the other side of the Pacific, we've got the CPPA, the California Consumer Protection, Privacy Protection Act. And that also has imposed GDPR type levels of protection on a lot of those Silicon Valley data industries. So I think we are starting to see a reaction to the hegemony of those large platforms. And I think that is just going to continue. And the big tipping point, I think, will be when the conversation properly turns from privacy protection and data protection to antitrust. And there, I think we will really start to see some regulatory movement.
Great, thanks, John.
Thank you.
Other questions from the team? Oh, yep. Thanks, Johnny. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted. Let me. Oh, there you go.
Hello, Johnny from the Circle. In times of crisis, movements of community acceptance change. And in this particular crisis, the boundaries of privacy are challenged. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, what has been the hardest philosophical or ethical decision you've had to face over the last 2 weeks, which tested the boundaries of privacy?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of things that I'm still working through, which I'm not able to share with you. But I think there will be something of a reckoning. I think we will go back over some of what we've observed and look at whether the response was necessary and proportionate. And I'm sorry I have to speak in such an elliptical way, but the urgency of the emergency has meant decisions have been taken not always with a deliberate and methodical consideration of the implications of that.
Thank you. You've been very diplomatic. Thank you.
Oh,
Peter, I've got a question that's come in from John, one of our members in Australia who wasn't able to join us but would like to watch the recording afterwards. And he is asking, in Australia, and in particular in government in Australia, privacy is a catch-all for anybody and everybody that doesn't wish to provide either data directly or by access to it. From this side of the ditch, it does appear that the New Zealand government is more open to sharing data as and when appropriate. Is this a Kiwi thing, or measures taken to ensure data is made available if there are genuinely no privacy concerns?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit easier sometimes in New Zealand just with having a single government. It can be a bit easier to achieve things when you don't have to deal across state lines and federal agencies and that sort of thing. But we do also have a sort of fairly enabling framework for sharing information. There are a number of mechanisms built into the legislation which allow for information sharing agreements, for example, and I kind of oversee those. There is no privacy law in the world that doesn't recognize the need for an importance of a fairly free flow of personal information. So privacy laws and data protection acts are really there to regulate the manner in which those transactions occur and to ensure that there are protections built in around them. They shouldn't get in the way of legitimate business. But they all have a sort of common theme and link back to principles articulated by the OECD back in 1980, which ask us to really examine the purpose for which information is obtained and to treat the information consistently with that purpose. So, for example, you can build a kind of sealed system around a health system and say, well, data just needs to go where it needs to go within the system, and that's okay, because that meets with the expectations of someone. When I go to a GP, I know that that GP is partly funded by the government, and so there will be some information transmitted to government in order to manage that subsidy. There'll be a lab that is run by a different business, and a pharmacy that is going to dispense subsidized medication to me. So the information has to flow within that system seamlessly in order to provide me with the services that I need. And we accept that, I think, because that is consistent with the overall purpose for which we are providing information, which is to improve our healthcare. I don't know if that answers your correspondence question.
Thank you. They're not here, so I can't ask follow up, but we'll see the recording. So thank you, John.
Right. Thanks, Sharon. Just looking at time, Sharon, are we okay for any more questions, or?
Yeah, I guess if there's one last question and we can wrap up.
Has anyone got a last burning question that they'd like to ask?
I've got a last question if no one else does.
Go for it, Helen.
I think, John, we could probably have a really long conversation over a glass of wine sometime. Hey, look, I am interested in our intense desire to have more information around health from a country level, a national level, right through to organisations asking. I went to a workplace just before lockdown that was asking me about health, sort of self-monitoring health questions, and I didn't have access to that building or to that organisation unless I shared that information. And that's the response that people are having, but that perceived safety and actual safety are two different things. And I think that need to ask the privacy in order to participate. I'm just wondering, whether there's an education element, or whether, how the Privacy Commissioner's office is responding to that type of invasion.
No, it's a good question. It sort of touches on Johnny's question too, which I sort of artfully sidestepped. But, I do worry about the over-collection of health information. And I worry because most of the businesses that are asking these questions are not qualified to do anything with that health information. We had a query from one agency early on in the crisis, which said, we want to know from our local DHB, everyone who is diagnosed as positive, because the kind of work we do takes us into the homes of a whole lot of people in our community, and we need to keep our people safe. Now, superficially, you can see the logic in that. But when you dig down, what are they really going to do differently? We were told to treat everyone as if they are positive. And if you're doing that, then you're taking what's called universal precautions. You're ensuring that you're adhering to the social distancing. You've got PPE if you need it. And you're not putting yourself at risk. Does knowing that somebody at address A is diagnosed positive actually modify or moderate the way you deal with somebody at address B who may not have been diagnosed but is as infectious? So these are some of the questions that we've been grappling with. Who needs to know? I very much worry about stigmatization and amateur clinicians making judgments that are not informed by a true clinical understanding. And in this, I'm taken back to the days of the AIDS crisis, when people were ostracized effectively by their condition and diagnosis. And a lot of fear and ignorance meant that there was prejudice and mistreatment of people in need of care and compassion.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Great phrases. Thank you.
Peter, I'll step in to formally close if that's okay by you now.
Good. Thank you, Sharon.
Time.
Thank you, John.
Yes, sorry, Peter. I'll give you a chance to say goodbye as well. If I will formally thank Peter and John, and in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind filling out the business sentiment poll in front of you, and I'll give you the results of that. And following the formal vote of thanks and the poll results, Tracy will put us into two private rooms so we can carry forward the conversations and a little bit of networking virtually, the best way that we can at the moment. So Peter, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you with us and love having you moderate our discussions. And of course, thank you again to Aura for your support of today's event. And John, thank you. You were so open and honest with us and shared so much, even if it had to be with diplomacy at times, but we appreciated it. And it was brilliant to hear from you at these times and hear what's front of mind for you and some of the insights that you're getting from government and the business community. So thank you so much. I'll share the poll results and then I can hand over to Peter and John for the last words. So 56% of us feeling challenged at the moment, 44% innovative, 78% believe the government is doing a good job presently, and overall 12 months of an estimate of when this will be over. And thank you 100% of you believing that today met your objectives. We appreciate your support. So perhaps Peter, if you have any final words, and then we can hand over to John before Trace moves us into our rooms.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks, Sharon, and thank you to the Circle for setting this up. Very interesting, John. Really enjoyed that and got some great insights. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it, and good to meet you.
Thank you.
Great. I will just stop the recording so that you know that